Good evening. Today is August 30th of 2025. I hope everybody had a good day. I want to talk to you about an event that happened 60 years ago. I was going to do this a little bit earlier, but my work as a pastor and a prison chaplain has kept me very busy. And this August 6th was actually the anniversary date. Voting is how we express our power in our democracy. It's how we peacefully use our voices to affect countless outcomes in our lives, including our access to public education, affordable housing, basic health care, employment opportunities, disaster relief, just to name a few. Voting is our foundational right. When that right is infringed upon, our democracy weakens exponentially. Uh, Politics has been described as who gets what, when, and how, whatever there is to get. And we all have a stake in government, in politics. Some are more active than others. But the most basic way one can participate, I realize some people do a lot in politics. They contribute money to campaigns, they display bumper stickers, buttons, yard signs, and all kinds of stuff. And, make phone calls, knock doors, do all kinds of stuff, attend campaign rallies. Not everybody's into that, but there's one thing that every person can do, which doesn't take much time. The most basic unit of political participation, voting. But not everybody's able to vote, and voting rights are under attack today. It was on August 6, 1965, that President Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law, enshrining protections for voters across the country who were historically denied access to the ballot box. This is a decade of many 60 anniversaries. The year 1964 was marked by the Mississippi Freedom Summer and the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Last year was the 60th anniversary of those events that were observed. This year marks the 60th anniversary of the march from Selma to Montgomery and of the signing of the Voting Rights Act. If you've seen the movie Selma, it brings out a lot of this stuff, in which one of the most memorable scenes is a telephone conversation between Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and President Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson had signed the Civil Rights Act a year before. And he was trying to focus on his war on poverty. And at one point, he was saying this voting thing has got to wait. Well, Dr. King said it can't wait. And Johnson was taking the go slow attitude. And in this conversation, Dr. King said, I'm a preacher from Atlanta. You're the head of the most powerful nation on earth, who a few months ago won re-election by the biggest landslide in history. And every second you're dismantling your legacy. Finally, Johnson made a speech before Congress in which he called for a comprehensive Voting Rights Act. And he concluded with the words, "We shall overcome." Well, this was one of the most significant achievements of the Civil Rights Movement, ending discriminatory voting practices and providing voters across the country with essential tools to fight discriminatory election rules and practices in various forms. There's a number of things, nothing happens in a vacuum. Uh, there's always something that went before it to influence it. And it was a long road for the Voting Rights Act. Many different events took place. And of course, there was the 13th Amendment in 1865 ended slavery. 14th Amendment gave citizenship to former slaves. That was in 1868. And then in 1870, there was the 15th Amendment that prohibited discrimination in the right to vote. Well, wasn't that all it was needed? Well, obviously, people found a way around it. And that's why we needed to have a Voting Rights Act that was 95 years after the 15th Amendment. But there was a number of Supreme Court cases and other developments led up to this. 1944, the landmark case of Smith versus Allwright, challenging the white primary system. This was in Houston, Texas, that there was an African American dentist named Lonnie Smith who was not allowed to vote in the Democratic primary. And we know today Texas is largely a Republican state, but that's not the way it's always been. Throughout much of Texas history, Democrats were in the majority. And if you won the Democratic primary, that was tantamount to winning the election. And so, people who paid their poll tax and met other requirements could vote in the general election. But by that time, the decision had already been made. And so if you didn't vote in the Democratic primary, your vote didn't count. And it was claimed that the Democratic Party was a private club, a private organization, so they could have an all-white primary. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court, 8-1, on April 3rd, 1944, struck down the white primary. Dr. Smith was allowed to vote, laid the groundwork for the political battlegrounds in the South. The impact was swift and far-reaching. In 1944, estimated 200,000 African Americans in the South were registered to vote. By 1952, there were 1 million registered. That doesn't mean that there was not opposition. In March 1965, black civil rights leaders and advocates from across the South gathered in Alabama to march from Selma to Montgomery to demand their right to vote and participate fully in our democracy. However, the march quickly turned horrific. Police forces mercilessly attacked and beat countless marchers. And this was on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday. Edmund Pettus, by the way, is named for a late Confederate general and leader of the Ku Klux Klan. So there's some controversy as to whether or not to keep the name or change the name, but that's beyond the scope of this video. But this exposed the fault lines of a nation that declared itself a democracy while allowing the citizens to be beaten and bloodied by police and state troopers. The events of Bloody Sunday demonstrated to President Johnson the civil rights movement could not wait any longer for voting rights. And the act was passed 5 months later. And by the way, one of Dr. King's books was called Why We Can't Wait. On August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed this act into law. This was the most significant achievement of the civil rights movement, ending discrimination like practices like poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses that was designed to prevent black people from voting. And establishing visionary pre-clearance requirements that for decades stopped voting discrimination before it occurred, providing voters with essential tools to fight discriminatory election rules and practices in various forms. I know that in 1964, I recall I was 13 years old at the time of the Mississippi Freedom Summer. My mother was not very political. and she didn't have a whole lot of education, but she knew what was going on. And I asked about why the black people were demonstrating in Alabama at the time. He said because, or admit that was in Mississippi, because they won't let them vote. And she knew that was wrong. The next year, when they were beating the marchers in Alabama, my late sister Betty was asked about that by my late nephew Paul Rawls, who was just a year younger than me. We grew up together, and Paul was like a brother to me. But he asked, why are they beating those people? And Betty said, because they're stupid. A very good way of putting it. And anyway, George Wallace was governor of Alabama at the time. And in the movie, Selma shows him coming to Washington and meeting with President Johnson. He said, George, you spent so much of your career working for the poor. Why do you want to get in on this race thing like he does? And he said, why don't you just let the Negroes in Alabama vote? You believe they have that right, don't you? Oh, sure, he said. But I don't have that authority. That rests with the county registrar. Well, Johnson knew that wasn't true. And, if he said, if you go back to Alabama and just tell them they can vote, I don't have to draft any civil rights legislation. Well, Wallace didn't cooperate. George Wallace, by the way, was an interesting man. He later was crippled by a would-be assassin's bullet. And eventually he renounced his support for segregation. And in his last run for governor in 1982, got the majority of the black vote in Alabama. But that would be later down the road. And by the way, when Johnson signed the law, they had a big ceremony and a lot of hoopla, celebration. And after it was all over, he was sitting in his office, and one of his staff members came in and found him very despondent. Mr. President, you got what you want. You ought to be elated. Bill, I think we have just handed the South over to the Republican Party. And that was true. And by the way, in 1964, the previous year, several southern states, which had all normally been Democratic, voted Republican. For Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, who was opposed to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And it gradually, more blacks, more Hispanics, more white liberals entered the Democratic Party. The Southern redneck, who had been the backbone of the Democratic Party for decades, felt disenfranchised. It did not happen overnight, but it happened. Eventually, they went to the Republican Party. At one time, Texas had a lot of people known as presidential Republicans. These were people who were considered themselves Democrats, voted in the Democratic primary, voted Democrat in most of the elections, but would vote Republican in the presidential race. In the 1950s, Texas conservative Democrat Governor Alan Shivers led that group, and they became known as Shivercrats as they supported Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower. And it's amazing how politics affects things. In 1956, in Mansfield, Texas, south of Fort Worth, there was a crisis for school desegregation. Dwight D. Eisenhower didn't do a thing. The following year, there was a similar crisis in Little Rock, Arkansas. Central High School regarding the Little Rock Nine. Well, this time Ike did get involved. He federalized the Arkansas National Guard and was able to ensure smooth desegregation of Central High School. But that was a year later. What's the difference between 56 and 57? Well, 1956, Ike was running for re-election. He needed the Southern redneck vote. 1957, he was already re-elected. He couldn't run for a third term, so he could do what was right. And he did. 1966, the South Carolina versus Katzenbach. Nicholas Katzenbach was Attorney General at the time, served under Kennedy and later under Johnson. And the founder of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, Thurgood Marshall, who later served on the Supreme Court. He litigated the landmark South Carolina versus Katzenbach Supreme Court case. He's then serving as Solicitor General. The decision in this case upheld the Voting Rights Act as a valid exercise of Congress' power to enforce the 15th Amendment. This case has reinforced the validity of the act, solidified the foundation of legal framework that enabled challenges to discriminatory voting practices for decades to come. Then in 1975, the Voting Rights Act were expanded to protect language minorities. And then 1986, Thornburg versus Jingles. The Supreme Court found the system of at-large elections in North Carolina illegally diluted black voting strength in violation of the Voting Rights Act. Then in 2013, Shelby County versus Holder was a seminal voting rights case that dismantled essential protections originally codified in the Voting Rights Act. So they began to chip away at things. And the court held that the coverage formula was outdated and did not reflect the changes to voting disparities that had occurred since the inception of the Voting Rights Act. The Shelby County versus Holder decision opened the door for implementation of suppressive voting laws, racial gerrymandering tactics that have severely harmed black voter power. And then there was, in 2021, Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee. The court's ruling that made it more difficult to enforce Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which allows individuals to bring discrimination in voting lawsuits to court. And a lot of crazy stuff's happened since then. Allen versus Milligan in 2021. It restricted case that successfully challenged the congressional map drawn in 2021 for violating Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. This was actually a historic win for voting rights. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of black voters, affirming the district's court orders striking down the congressional map, requiring that Alabama redraw the map to include a second congressional district, providing black voters the opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. The case was argued by Legal Defense Fund Director of Litigation, Dewell Ross. In 2023, just 2 years ago, Alexander versus South Carolina State Conference of the NAACP, a racial gerrymandering case that challenged South Carolina's 2022 congressional redistricting map, and a 6-3 decision issued May 23, 2024. The Supreme Court reversed a federal trial court's unanimous finding that South Carolina's 1st Congressional District is an unconstitutional racial gerrymander, allowing South Carolina's discriminatory congressional map to stand. And then There's a lot of ongoing cases like Louisiana versus Callis. In a redistricting case, the Supreme Court will determine the future of Louisiana's congressional map. On June 27, 2025, just a couple of months ago, the Supreme Court issued an order to argue the case next term. Louisiana's current map of two majority black districts remains in effect, and the re-argument of the case is likely to occur during the fall of 2024. There's also the ongoing case of the League of Women Voters versus Trump. This is a lawsuit to challenge Trump's unlawful executive order requiring a passport or similar documentation of citizenships in order to register to vote, effectively attempting to seize voter registration rules that Congress and the states. These requirements would violate federal law and the Constitution if carried on out by the Election Assistance Commission. On April 24, 2025, a federal court blocked the documentary proof of citizenship requirement. And while the case proceeds, this injunction preserves the status quo. Would-be voters already affirm under penalty of perjury that they are U.S. citizens on the federal form. So, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a major step forward. But as you can see, there's been some steps taken backwards, and some people would like to go even further back. Let us always remember that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Have a great evening, and God bless all of you.